I'm a big fan of self-hosting, but sometimes my environment could go down. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at an Ollama endpoint that we have running on our local host, and also have that endpoint published to a fully qualified domain name, or a FQDN, and it's locked down so only an allowed list of IP addresses can access it. But sometimes, this service can go down because it is self-hosted, and any applications that I have that are consuming this then could lose some of its functionality. And so we need a more resilient and fault tolerant way to handle this. And not too long ago, Ollama Cloud came out, where there is a free service which does limit the number of requests that you can make per hour and per week. But if we're using this as a backup, then that should be okay. And you do want to make sure that whatever model you're using locally, we're also going to be using on the cloud version. And in this case, we're going to be using the GPT OSS 20 billion parameter model because it is fairly lightweight, making it run on more affordable hardware. So if you have a Mac or a computer with unified memory, then you should be able to run this model without any issues, as long as you have 16 gigabytes of VRAM or unified memory available. And so with a fresh Rails 8 application, we're going to go ahead and set this up where we're going to use our local service first, but then we're going to have a failover if our local service isn't available to then fall back to the cloud version. So we're going to do a bundle add in the Ruby-OpenAI. It is a gem that I like to use to communicate with the OpenAI API. And then somewhere we need to create another file, and I'm just going to call this the Ollama_client.rb. And I'm going to put it in the model folder, but if you have a services folder or some other place that you want to put the business logic, you can do that as well. And so basically, we're going to have a class method, and we'll just call it the chat. We're going to take in our messages, our model, which will just default to the GPT OSS 20 billion parameters. And the documentation for the Ollama Cloud does have a -cloud on there, but you don't have to actually use that. If the endpoint is your local service, then this is going to work fine. Or if it's the cloud endpoint, that's going to work as well. Our temperature we'll set to a default 0.7, and then we'll have a stream which we'll set to false. We're not going to set up the stream in this episode because I have done that in many other episodes, because I really want to focus on this failover. We'll create a new instance of the Ollama client, and then we'll have an instance method called chat, where we pass in each one of these parameters. So we'll send our messages to the messages, the model to the model, the temperature, we'll send that to the temperature, and for the stream, we'll set the stream. We can initialize, which we don't really need anything there yet, but then we'll have our instance method for the chat. We'll have the messages, the model, the temperature, and then the stream. And you could set the defaults here again, but that's not really necessary because we are passing them in. But if in your application, you have a mix of creating a new instance and then calling the chat, or if you're calling the class method, then you may want to put the defaults in here as well. It's not going to hurt anything, unless if you come and change the temperature at one point, but you forget to also change it down in the instance method. So we'll first create our parameters, which is what we're going to be passing into the client. And again, that's just all the same stuff. We can make the request, or we have a response. We'll set that equal to our client.chat, and then we can pass in the parameters. So this chat client, we can create the OpenAI client. We'll make a new instance of it with a URI base, and then I'm going to put in the Ollama.railsapp.dev. That's just a local instance that I have running. With the OpenAI API, we can get our response. We can dig through the choices. We'll grab the first item. We'll get our message and then the content. So basically, this interaction is done where if we call the Ollama client chat, we can pass in some messages and then we should get a string back. So that's basically going to look like if we have our messages, it does need to be an array. And this array is going to be with hashes where you have a role. It can be system or user or assistant, and then we'll have a content. And with that, we can then call the Ollama client chat, and then we need to pass in our messages, and we'll pass in that array. So I'll go ahead and copy that, and then we can go ahead and try this out. I'll pull up my Rails console, I'll paste this in, and for the first request, it'll take a moment for the Ollama client on my server to load up, and then we should get a string back after the model gets loaded up and the content is generated. And so that's great. But if our service ever goes down, which I can just illustrate with a brew services, we'll stop the Ollama service. And now, if we were to call the same thing, you'll see that we got an error where the API is down. And so that's what we need to resolve in this episode. And so to do that, we're going to have to make some changes. For example, where we are calling the endpoint, we're not going to be able to do that directly by itself. Instead, I'm going to create a class constant where we're just going to have an array of these. So we'll have at first our local server, and then we'll have the HTTPS ollama.com for the cloud service. This chat method is going to stay the same. And for the initialize, we need to know what our current index is. So I'm just going to set an instance variable, current endpoint index. We'll set it to 0, meaning that we're first going to try our Rails app.dev endpoint. Our parameter building is going to be the same, but instead of calling the client.chat like this, we're going to create another method. We'll call it the attempt with failover. We'll create a block for the client, and then we'll just pass this in just like we did before. So this attempt with failover is kind of where all of the magic happens. We'll have our endpoints. We'll loop through them, each with index. We'll get the endpoint string and then our index. And then we'll set our client is equal to, and then we need to build that client. And we're going to pass in the endpoint. Now your application could be a little bit different because you may need an API key. If you have one for your local server that's different than the one that you're going to be using for the cloud, then you may need to also pass in the API key here as well. But luckily, with the local Ollama instance, we can provide an API key, and it can be right or wrong, doesn't matter, and it'll still work. And I'm not too worried about this because of the allowed list that I have on this domain. Only the IP addresses that I put in the allow list are going to be able to access the endpoint. So we'll take our build client, and now we'll have our endpoint that we'll just pass into the URI base. We're then going to have a result is equal to our yield of the client. And that's kind of interesting because essentially what that's going to do, we have this block, which is essentially our client. And this is pretty interesting, but essentially what this is going to do is execute the block, and then we'll return that result. We can have a rescue, which if by default, if you remember, this caused a Faraday server error, which we can rescue from this or any other errors like a connection failed. And if that happens, we can call next if our index is less than the endpoint's length minus 1, meaning that we're not at the end of them. Otherwise, if some other error happened, we can call the same thing where if the index is less than the endpoint's length minus 1, we can call next. Otherwise, we can raise. And basically, with something like this, if we have exhausted all of the endpoints, we can do some kind of raise, and we'll create a custom error like all endpoints failed, and we can put in the message of what failed. We'll create this custom error, inheriting from the standard error. And by doing that, we're first going to try to make the API call to our first service. And if that fails due to a connection error, then it'll try the second one. And so we can test this out. I've reloaded the terminal. We'll then make the call. And this is great because we didn't get the Faraday connection error or the server error, but now we got a 401. And that's because we haven't put in our API key. So we can put in our access token, and you'll want to put this in a Rails credential or something similar. But for the purposes of this episode, I'm just going to put in plain text. We'll create an API key. I'll copy this and paste it in. Again, you'll want to make sure that you're not pasting in the API key in plain text here. Use a Rails credential, environment variable, or something similar. But I'll go ahead and reload this. We'll make the call again, and now it worked. And because we made the API call, we now got our usage dashboard where we can see our hourly usage was at 0.1%. So this is working great. If I were to start up the Ollama service locally, and if I were to make the call again, It's then going to be using my local system hardware to generate the response. And if we come back here, you'll see that it did not increment the usage because it did use the local endpoint that I had, because it's now up and running and working. But you do want to be careful when you are calling this. You don't want to call it directly within your application code. It should always be called from a background job because we are making an API request. And if for whatever reason the first endpoint timed out and then it called the second one, that's just going to be an even longer request. So you could get browser timeouts or something similar. So make sure that you're always calling any API requests in a background job. And that's just as a general rule of thumb. There are some exceptions, of course, with OAuth logins or Stripe billing. But for something like this, it should definitely go into a background job. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. For more videos, check out driftandruby.com.